Welcome back, Wolfpack. Vrolas here to a facts, stats, trivia, and a top 10 for the fire typing. So please leave a comment down below on the next type you want to see get a top 10 and trivia and all sorts of goodness. Also leave a like if you just enjoy the series in general. It really helps out. So now let's go and look at the fire typing defensively. So the fire typing has a lot of really interesting offensive and defensive matchups. I'm just going to put them all here at once to show you guys what kind of weird balance that we have right here. So with the fire typing, we have three somewhat common weaknesses, and some of these weaknesses are so common because fire is such a strong typing. So ground, we're going to talk about ground soon, but with earthquake and all the reliability and damage that comes from that move, fire is going to be very threatened by that. It's also going to be naturally threatened by water. Just that's physics and stuff right there, and that's how life works. And then rock. So with rock, it's also just a weakness that, you see it from time to time, and people do carry more and more rock moves because of fire type Pokemon in general. Looking at resistances, we get a lot of resistances. Bug, steel, fire, grass, ice, and fairy. So with the fairy typing being introduced in 6th generation as a very powerful typing, fire got a somewhat substantial buff against fairy types and just in general, because that resistance right there means now you can bring in a fire type Pokemon to handle a fairy type Pokemon in some situations, and it works out really well like that. Also offensively, we are super balanced. Bug, grass, ice, and steel as super effective hits, but we also have 4 resistances as well with dragon, fire, rock, and water. So everything about the fire type is really balanced. That it's kind of like the fire triangle in a way that as long as all of its parts are together, you're going to succeed pretty well at burning everything down, I guess. Okay, that got dark. Let's just go and look at the stat breakdown. So for all fully evolved fire type Pokemon, we get a really interesting mix of stats that nothing is lower than 10th place, so at least all of the stats are in the top 10 amongst all of the typings for fire, and that's pretty solid. Very high amount of special attack, solid amount of hit points, not the craziest average speeds, but that just shows, we could have a super really slow fire type Pokemon and then some really fast fire type Pokemon. Really all you have to do is worry about the defenses, but with ground and rock being physical, that's not too much of a problem, and we also have some good offenses from the attack. And somehow it all comes together, making fire the second highest typing for base stat totals on average, compared to dragon, which has absurd stats anyways, and we already reviewed dragon. So yeah. So now let's go and look at some cool Pokemon for trivia and whatnot. So Primal Groudon, as a primal legendary that gains a lot of stats, it's going to be the highest fire type Pokemon that for base stat total, and it also provides the single highest fire type stat with its attack. Charizard Y, though, is close behind with a high special attack, giving it the highest stat for a non-legendary fire-type Pokemon, and just a lot of cool power overall. Both of these Pokemon do have Drought, and the only other Pokemon to have Drought that is a fire-typing Pokemon, or the only other Drought Pokemon in general. So there are only a few amount of Pokemon that can bring sunlight naturally. Looking at stats by the numbers, there are 8 legendary fire-type Pokemon, including Primal Groudon, which actually gains the fire-typing through its Primal Reversion. We also have 8th place as where fire type stands amongst all the other types, with only 8.3% of Pokemon being the fire type, so that includes some megas and other forms and stuff. But one of the more interesting things is that fire typing has the highest base damage modifier for an offensive move, and that's just through a lot of really unfortunate scenarios for that Pokemon. So in Intense Sunlight, with a Bug Steel Pokemon, and that Pokemon has been affected by Forest Curse, we get a ton of damage right there. That Bug Steel and a Grass typing means you have an 8 times weakness to fire. Then we get Intense Sunlight, so that's going to be 50% right there. If that Pokemon also has Dry Skin, then it even gets modified higher by 25% more, bringing us 15 times damage if all of these situations occur. And I mean, just Forest Curse on a Bug Steel Pokemon, that's already 8 times right there, so that's a super amount of damage as well. If the opposing Pokemon is attacking with a Flash Fire boost or Blaze boost, it means we have over 20 times power multiplier on that. And at the same time, it can also be the lowest multiplier possible in the game that isn't immune by anything, because in Rain, against a Fire Dragon Pokemon that has Thick Fat while Water Sport is in effect, it has 0.02 times damage. That is going to do nothing. Some other cool fire-type facts are going to be that in Generation 3, it was the only generation that introduced a fire-type move that did not have the word fire in its name. So if we look at, we have Fire Blast, we have Sacred Fire, we have Mystical Fire, we have all these other moves with fire in the name except in Generation 3. I guess they really tried to mix it up, and you can kind of see that because it was like Blaze and Blast, and they tried to say cool things like Heat Wave. because that's when all of these moves were introduced. And we also had Will-O-Wisp being introduced in the 3rd generation, one of the stronger fire-type moves on a status kind of level. But the hardest hitting fire-type move is going to go to V-Create. V-Create is the 3rd highest damage move in the game that doesn't need any kind of factors, because technically we have Reversal and Flail. Those have up to 200 base power, but V-Create just comes in with a whopping 180 base power without anything, that you just go and use it like that, only being outclassed by Self-Destruct and Explosion. Looking at PokemonDB.net for our fire typing matchups, pure fire type damage is going to show, just like how we saw it offensively, that we have a lot of not very effective hits, but we also have a lot of super effective hits. If we want even more super effective hits, we just add ground typing to give us that, and if we want less not very effective hits, we add ghost. And between fire, ghost, and ground, we have it to where there are no not very effective hits, so we hit everything neutrally. And this does have some accuracy flaws to it, that Pokemon DB does not track abilities, so Pokemon with Flash Fire are going to be handled differently, but for the most part, this is very accurate. And now we're in Pokemon Showdown, which means it's time for the top 10 fire-type Pokemon, and I'm going to lead the list with Mega Camerupt. Now, we will talk about this in just a second. I do want to talk about the rest of the top 10. It is a really funny list when you break it down, because there's such a, I would say, power gap between like the bottom 5 and the top 5 fire-type Pokemon, and outside of the top 5, really a lot of fire-type Pokemon can realistically fit inside the top 10. So you might see things you disagree with, but overall, depending on which aspects you're looking about the Pokemon, then we can actually figure out, like, okay, maybe this Pokemon does belong on it, maybe it doesn't. And the reason why I put Mega Camerupt here is because generally on my lists, like the top 10 slot, like the 10th place slot, will be a Pokemon that has very, very high potential, but very, very difficult to use or doesn't always find situations. With Mega Camerupt, it is some of the highest damage you will find with an Eruption, with a Heat Wave. In double battles under a Trick Room, this guy pumps out absurd amounts of damage because 145 special attack using Eruption or using a Sheer Force boosted Heat Wave or being able to hit everything except for like a Flash Fire Pokemon with Lava Plume, it just outputs absurd amounts of damage in a multi-Pokemon scenario. But at the same time, you do have to support it with Trick Room. If it gets outsped and then it takes damage, then you can't rely on the huge amounts of Eruption damage, so then you have to use Heat Wave, which doesn't do as much, but does get a good Sheer Force boost. Overall, like, this Pokemon does damage, and I feel it needs to be on the list somewhere because Mega Camerupt has a huge amount of power and a huge amount of potential. Alright, number 9 is going to be Infernape. Now, Infernape, it's hard to really pinpoint this Pokemon's power because it's a good mixed Pokemon. It has a good amount of attack, a good amount of special attack, and a pretty solid speed. 108 isn't the fastest, but you can find some pretty decent outspeeds. And with high base power moves such as Close Combat, access to Earthquake, you have moves like Flare Blitz, so Flare Blitz is going to be damage, you have Priority. You can also be very supportive, that in doubles you get access to Fake Out. You also have access to Bullet Punch, you can use Quick Guard. Like, there's a lot of things Infernape can do. If it was a little bit tankier, it could even tank out Pokemon really well because it does have Slack Off. And at the same time, Infernape can use something like Overheat. So, I mean, I'm just randomly posting things up here. This isn't a moveset or anything, but it just kind of shows the diversity of that Infernape has. You Focus Sash on it, Blaze is going to activate, or you can Iron Fist because you have good Elemental Punch coverage. You have access to, like, Thunder Punch and stuff like that. So you have a lot of really weird damage boosting, you have a lot of high power potential. You know, you just come in with Overheat, like Focus Sash into Overheat, and then you can transition to Physical. Infernape has a lot of speed, diversity, and power, and that's why it's number 9. Alright, number 8 on the list is going to be Typhlosion. Now, Typhlosion got a really nice buff recently. Flash Fire. Now you bring in Typhlosion onto a Fire-type move, and now you have one of the strongest Eruptions in the game with a lot more speed than Mega Camerupt. So generally what you can do is you can like max out the speed on Typhlosion, or you can find a really interesting speed breakdown. I talk about this in my Typhlosion guide, so I'll also have like a link in the description to that, because Typhlosion has a lot of really nice quirks about it. You can run Modest for the highest damage possible, you still get some tankiness in there, which can actually work out for survivability and then some later game transitioning. You can run something like a Choice Scarf, and then you just switch in, you get the Flash Fire boost, and now your Eruption almost unstoppable because it has that Flash Fire boosting with some of the highest base power in the game that's getting stabbed while outspeeding a ton of Pokemon. Now Typhlosion, it is one-dimensional in this way. That can really just come in, maybe extra sensory for coverage, or go for like one huge flamethrower at the end of the game if it's already taken a lot of damage and Eruption doesn't have damage. So it doesn't have a great amount of coverage. A lot of just base fire-type Pokemon don't. So you come in, you just use your move, and you hope it's enough to knock out the opponent. You can get predicted and switched and walled like that, but Typhlosion does clean up pretty well, so I will put it on the list as a very fast and potentially devastating Pokemon with some decently rounded base stats. Alright, number 7 on the list is going to be Arcanine. Now here's where the list gets weird, because realistically I could have put Entei on this up to this point, I could have put Darmanitan up to this point, but at the same time, Arcanine, it is a big staple in the Spinda swap combo. So what you do is you take Spinda, you skill swap Contrary onto it, and then you just out-tank with Close Combat, thus boosting your defenses with Contrary. You also have Morning Sun, which lets you heal, and overall Arcanine is just a huge frustrating tank that you can build it with a little bit of special defense investment, run Will-O-Wisp, and then just shut down your opponent's team. That it can tank hits really well. And with the Morning Sun, it has sustain. So you throw out the Will-O-Wisp, you weaken your opponent, you use Morning Sun, you have like a lot of other coverage moves. If you want to be tankier, you can like get rid of Close Combat and put in just like a fire type attack. You also have extreme speed, so suddenly you have a lot of power behind you and a decent amount of attacks. That Arcanine has a really high base stat total, so 100 special attack, 110 attack, 90 hit points, and 80 on the defenses with 95 speed. This Pokemon cleans up, and it just has a lot of stat bulk, just offensively and defensively. So I think that it does find places on the list that if you build a team around Arcanine, or you use it as a central wall against whatever your team needs to be resisted, because there are a lot of resistances from that fire typing, Arcanine can come in and do a lot of work. But next up, we have a tank that just goes without comprehension. Number 6 on the list is going to be Torkoal. And here's the thing about Torkoal. Very, very high skill cap Pokemon. You have to know exactly how to use it, when to use it, where to use it, and what you need your team to do, because there are a couple of diversities that you can do with the moveset, and if you understand the ins and outs of Torkoal, it doesn't really matter, that you use it as a pure physical tank. Whenever your opponent tries anything physical, you bring in Torkoal, you go for something like a Yawn, and then you have to like make your opponent make these tough decisions, switching out, staying in. You go for Protect predictions, and then you also have something like Stealth Rock. Stealth Rock is going to let you set up, get your opponent just shifting around pretty hard, and you even get access to Lava Plume. Lava Plume makes it to where there's a 30% chance to burn your opponent, so now you can throw out the Yawn. If you don't want them switching out, you just throw out Lava Plumes until they get burned, and you even have access to something like Clear Smog. So there's a lot of really weird diversities in the moveset, like I mentioned before, and if you play Torkoal very masterfully, it will eventually get you a lot of effective gain, and you really won't notice it in the battle, which is why some people don't understand its strength as a Pokemon. You might get 1 or 2 burns, you might be able to shift out a couple Pokemon through Stealth Rocks, you can use it to just completely wall Pokemon. You put a Rocky Helmet on it, and it can do a lot of really nasty things, and then with the Clear Smog, if your opponent's trying to set up physically, like with Swords Dance or something, Torkoal, Clear Smog them, Lava Plume, burn them, switch out Torkoal, and now you just gained so much from a Pokemon that could have potentially swept you, because Torkoal is like the anti-meta Pokemon. And because of that, I'm putting it number 6 on the list. It does need to shine, but it has a lot of mastery that you're not going to pick up and play Torkoal perfectly from the first couple battles, that you need to lose with it to understand what you need to do better to win with it. And because of that, high mastery, very high power, and that's Torkoal. Number 5 on the list is going to be Volcarona, because it is the best Quiver Dance Pokemon in the game. Quiver Dance, one of the best moves in the game. It boosts your special attack, special defense, and speed. That's it. Like, some just boost special attack, some just boost speed, some boost like 2 moves. No, this one boosts 3, and they're all very usable for Volcarona. That while you don't have a lot of defenses and you are 4 times weak against rock, if you eliminate any rock threats on your opponent's team, you come in, you set up 1 or 2 Quiver Dances, you pretty much win. And Volcarona is a bulky Pokemon to begin with, that with 85 hit points, 1 of 5 special defense, even some defensive investment to survive some solid hits, you're good to go. You slap a Citrus Berry, a Leftovers, something like that, you Quiver Dance, and then you also have Fiery Dance. Fiery Dance is an exclusive move for you, and it has a 50% chance to raise your special attack. So you use an 80 base power move, which isn't bad at all, you can raise your special attack, and now you have absurd amounts of damage, you Bug Buzz for coverage, and overall Volcarona, it's one of the fastest just setup Pokemon. That it comes in, it uses Quiver Dance twice, and then your team loses. And if you don't get in and stop it quick enough, it can be very devastating, because then it becomes hard to switch into, and Volcarona is just going to be a very nasty Pokemon, but a very high base stat, high power Pokemon. Alright, so number 4 is going to be Blaziken. So Blaziken, this Pokemon is a very interesting Pokemon to talk about, because its Mega Form and its regular form kind of do the same things. That Blaziken has a lot of different diversity paths, that it can go for multiple layers of setup, it can go for just outright damage, and with its speed boost hidden ability, it's a very, very threatening Pokemon because it comes in, it can use Protect on that first turn, and now you're dealing with a 120 attack Pokemon and a 110 attack Pokemon. So now it's like Infernape, but just better in every way, that after one speed boost we're outspeeding it, and then we have more damage options, and we can go for ridiculous setup, and we still have some very high base power moves to use along with it. So Blaziken's main frailty is going to be just if the opponent doesn't get KO'd. If the opponent doesn't get KO, Blaziken can't handle a lot of redemption hits back, and that's kind of it. Other than that, it's going to find a lot of reliable outspeeds. It's going to have a lot of reliable setup opportunities that if you bring it in when your opponent has his pants down, oh, I can't deal with Blaziken, I have to switch out. That's a free speed boost, that's free damage, that's free setup. And then Blaziken does very terrible things from there. So, very powerful Pokemon, and this is what I mean. Now, suddenly, like, the top 5 Pokemon are super stacked, because Volcarona, it sets up and win. Blaziken, it sets up and win. But for number 3, I'm going to put Heatran. And Heatran is just such a strong Pokemon right now, because it's the ultimate anti-fairy type Pokemon. That if you have some fairy weakness on your team, like you're trying to revolve around dragon type Pokemon, dark type Pokemon, you just throw in Heatran, and now your team is safe. So Heatran's just super tanky as well. High amounts of hit points, high amounts of defenses, very high amount of special attack. This Pokemon can absorb a hit really well and then deal with a harder hit back in a lot of situations. With Flash Fire, it nullifies Fire-type Pokemon. With its Fire and Steel typing, both resisting Fairy, it can pretty much eliminate Fairy-type Pokemon and throw out a Steel hit back. It just has a really good amount of coverage, a lot of utility. You can run it purely offensive. You can run it as a stall Pokemon with Roar. So you can like Toxic Stall with Roar through Stealth Rocks. It can set up, it can damage, and it's just a really good staple that if you need a Pokemon on your team, Heatran can work in a lot of situations if you aren't already ground weak, pairing it with a Pokemon like Rotom or a Levitate Pokemon, and now you cover for its weaknesses, and you just do really well, because Heatran is just a very stable Pokemon with high amounts of defenses, high amounts of damages, and a high amount of utility, so it's going to be number 3 on the list just because of its plug-and-play ability, not necessarily its sweeping power. Alright, number 2 is going to be Talonflame. Talonflame is just a stupid Pokemon with how strong it is that it gets Gale Wings, so now why not have a Brave Bird that out-prioritizes everything, just go and slam damage. Also has Swords Dance, it has Taunt, it has Roost. You can run this Pokemon bulkily, set up 1 or 2 Swords Dance, and then just knock out everything anyway. Roost up any damage you take, you run Brave Bird for damage, you can Taunt, so if your opponent's trying to set up against you, you just run Taunt, and now they can't even set up, and then you get a Swords Dance while they're switching out, and then you get an untouchable Brave Bird. So Talonflame's main weakness is going to be Rocks. That if Stealth Rocks is on the field, Talonflame is going to have a bad time because it takes 4 times damage to Stealth Rocks. It loses half of its health instantly. So that could be a very bad thing for Talonflame, but at the same time, if your team doesn't have a counter to Talonflame, your team has no way of stopping Talonflame, you pretty much just lose, because nothing's going to survive the Brave Bird. If you can't knock it out the turn it's trying to roost, it can be very devastating, and that's the main thing about Talonflame, is it's very unpredictable. Are you going to go up against a Choice Band set? Because Choice Band Talonflame, very powerful, that you just run Adamant Nature, you outspeed everything, and then you just go for raw damage until you die, but this can get 2 or 3 KOs. So if you fear the Choice Band damage and switch out and then find out it's a Swords Dance set, well now you're in trouble, because these things can run with a little bit of like mixed defensive bulk. It already has a really high amount of speed, and it's already using a lot of priority anyways. So it doesn't need to worry about speed because of the Gale Wings making it +1. Then has something like Leftovers, a Rocky Helmet, or Citrus Berry. It kind of just becomes a really filthy tank that's now setting up Swords Dance with a very high amount of base power from its Brave Bird. But this is really weird as well, because Talonflame adds to the weakness. That Rock wasn't really seen as something too common, but then when Talonflame came in, Rock is almost mandatory on a lot of teams if you just so you don't have to worry about facing a Talonflame. So there is a lot of play around it, and it has weakened while strengthening the fire typing in general. And the number 1 strongest Pokemon is going to be Charizard X for the fire typing. That, as I have already said too many times, all these Pokemon, they like going for setup and they like going for a hard win, but Charizard X just does it the best because of Dragon Dance and Tough Claws. So it comes in, it wants to set up against a Pokemon that isn't ready for it. So you bring it, like you bring it as a revenge Pokemon, and then you can just kind of win with it. That, okay, Charizard comes in, the opponent has to switch out, so you get a free Dragon Dance. Now you're going to be faster than your opponent. Now you have Tough Claws, and then you have Flare Blitz, and nothing can really survive that. That only some very few Pokemon like Heatran to maybe get the prediction and wall out the Flare Blitz while getting a Flash Fire can do something about it. But overall, it can just run a lot of things. It also has Dragon Claw. So then you get a Stab move that also gets Tough Claws boost and Dragon Dance damage. And then you can run something like Roost. Roost means that after you Flare Blitz and take damage, you roost it back up, and then your opponent, as they're trying to set up, you just get more Dragon Dances than them. You just out-damage them, and there's really nothing you can do. Like, you can't tank and become a faster, like, setup tank than Dragon Dance is happening with the Charizard. You just have to hope that you get an outspeed, even though it can have a 100 base speed, so it uses Dragon Dance on top of that, and only the fastest of Scarf Pokemon or some very high damaging Focus Sash Pokemon can save you by that point, and on that you just have to hope you eventually chip it away or get lucky and knock it out, because if it gets set up too much, it's just devastating. On that, it can also just kind of find a room for Earthquake that, okay, with Flare Blitz, I'm walled out by Fire-type Pokemon, use Earthquake, and then that problem is pretty much solved. So with its amount of unpredictability in the moveset, you can't use Heatran all the time to successfully handle it, and you don't know which move it's going to use because with Dragon Dance providing a lot of damage boosting to it, it's going to be hard to knock out. And even then, Charizard X, when it Mega Evolves, it gets defense. So now you can't physically beat it up too hard, has a decent amount of hit points, and because of the speed boosting and attack boosting, can run these weird mixed hit point sets which give you a lot of bulk, and unless you hit it directly super effective for that one hit that you get, and if you don't knock it out, it can just out-roost, it can out-damage, it's just going to win, and that's why Charizard X is very terrifying. As for Charizard Y, I feel Charizard Y itself can make it on the top 10 list as well. That just because I'm putting Charizard X here doesn't mean Charizard Y is good. I just didn't want 2 of the top 10 being both Charizard forms. Because for Charizard Y, when it Mega Evolves in double battles or even single battles, it gets Drought. As we mentioned earlier, very few Pokemon get Drought, and Charizard Y is the strongest non-legendary Drought Pokemon. So Charizard Y lets you use a huge Heat Wave with 159 base special attack, modest boosted, or maybe even timid for damage, and then it gets Sun, and it gets Stab, so a neutral hit Heat Wave, not many things can survive, and it just provides way too much damage. It also has some supportive capabilities with Tailwind, and it gains special defense in its Mega Evolution, so it can even survive Thunderbolts and Water-type attacks like that. So Charizard is one of the strongest Fire-type Pokemon. I think Game Freak did a good job with that in the 6th generation. But they gave it 2 Mega Evolutions, and they gave it so much diversity, so much play. So it's really good to see that one of the old school Pokemon getting some power from that. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Those were the top 10 Fire-type Pokemon, as well as some Fire-type trivia, and I hope you all have a nice day. Thank you for watching.